everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed true crime stories and deep dives into the darkest corners of history, you're in the right place. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment to let me know your thoughts or cases you'd like to see next. It really helps the channel grow and keeps the content coming. Now, let's get into today's story. In the cold autumn of 1831, deep in the wilderness of what was then Orange Township, Ohio, James Abraham Garfield, the youngest of 5, entered the world in a one-room log cabin. His father, Abraham Garfield, had traveled from New York with a heart full of hope, pursuing a childhood love. But when he arrived, he found her already married, and so he married her sister, Eliza Ballou. Together, they would start a family under the most modest of circumstances. James was named after a previous son lost in infancy. In 1833, seeking solace and direction, the family joined a small but devout Stone Campbell church, an act that would soon shape the moral framework for their youngest son. But tragedy came swiftly. That same year, Abraham Garfield died suddenly, leaving Eliza a widow and James, barely a toddler, fatherless. Left to raise 5 children alone, Eliza Garfield became a force of resilience. Fiercely independent and deeply spiritual, she carved out a life for her family through grit and sacrifice. James was her favorite, their bond unshakable. Through loss, poverty, and the harsh realities of frontier life, she never let him forget that he was destined for more. It was July 2nd, 1881, in Washington, D.C. The newspapers had made it public. President James A. Garfield was scheduled to depart the capital for his summer vacation. He planned to stop at Williams College to deliver a speech. He was in good spirits, accompanied by his sons, James and Harry, and his Secretary of State, James G. Blaine. No bodyguards, no security detail. At the time, such protections were rare, even for a president. But someone else had read the papers. Charles J. Guiteau, a failed lawyer, a delusional drifter, and now a man with a mission. He arrived at the Baltimore and Potomac station that morning in a cab. As he stepped out, the driver asked if he should wait. Guiteau replied, "No, I'm going to jail." Inside the station, as President Garfield crossed the waiting room, Guiteau made his move. He stepped forward, raised his revolver, and fired. The first bullet grazed the president's shoulder. The second struck him in the back, ripping through his body, missing the spine, but lodging deep behind the pancreas. Garfield collapsed to the floor. Chaos erupted. But Guiteau didn't get far. He collided with Officer Patrick Kearney, who had rushed in after hearing the shots. Kearney tackled him. So overcome with adrenaline, he forgot to disarm him until they reached the station. Kearney shouted, "In God's name, man, why did you shoot the president?" Guiteau responded, "I am a stalwart, and I want Arthur for president." As police dragged Guiteau to safety, he made a declaration that echoed across the nation. "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. I did it, and I want to be arrested." Arthur is president now. In an instant, whispers of conspiracy flooded Washington. Was Vice President Charles A. Arthur involved? Had the stalwart faction of the Republican Party ordered a political hit? Guiteau believed that by killing Garfield, he was healing the Republican Party's division. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer, he was a patriot. The truth was far more tragic and more delusional. Garfield wasn't aligned with either major Republican faction. But Guiteau, consumed by fanaticism, had convinced himself that the assassination would unite the party and that he would be rewarded. President James A. Garfield would cling to life for weeks. But the bullet and the era's crude medical care would ultimately prove fatal. And America would be left to reckon with a president's murder committed in broad daylight by a man who wanted to be noticed. President James A. Garfield had survived the bullets, but he was far from safe. Carried up the stairs in the Baltimore and Potomac rail station, conscious, but trembling in shock, he clung to life while the doctors, powerless and uncertain, searched blindly for the bullet lodged deep inside him. For Robert Lincoln, son of Abraham Lincoln, it was a haunting déjà vu. 16 years earlier, he had been by his father's deathbed. Now, another president had been gunned down, this time before his eyes. Garfield was brought back to the White House. Doctors warned he wouldn't survive the night. But the president defied expectations. By morning, he was alert. Hope stirred across the nation. As the summer of 1881 stretched on, so did the vigil. Every day, Americans awaited bulletins from Garfield's sick room. But behind closed doors, his condition teetered between fragile improvement and terrifying decline. To ease the oppressive DC heat, Navy engineers built a crude but effective air cooler, fans blowing air over ice to drop the temperature in his room by 20 degrees. Yet, while the room cooled, Garfield's body burned. In a time before sterilization was common practice, doctors repeatedly probed Garfield's wounds with unwashed fingers and instruments. One even punctured his liver. Infection took root. Desperate, Alexander Graham Bell invented a metal detector to locate the bullet. But the device failed, sabotaged by the interference of Garfield's metal bed frame and the obstinate ignorance of his lead physician, Dr. Willard Bliss, who refused to let Bell scan the left side of the president's body. Garfield, once a robust man of 210 pounds, wasted away to 130. Unable to eat, he was fed through nutrient enemas. His body, ravaged by sepsis, erupted in abscesses. The president drifted in and out of hallucinations. His pain was constant, his suffering relentless. In a final act of hope, citizens built a rail line overnight to carry him to the seaside town of Elberon, New Jersey. They believed the ocean air might ease his pain. But the damage was done. New infections set in. On September 19, 1881, 79 days after the shooting, President James A. Garfield died at 10:30 p.m. The official cause, a ruptured splenic artery aneurysm, brought on by months of unchecked sepsis. Most experts today believe Garfield would have survived, if not for the care meant to save him. European doctors had already embraced antiseptic medicine, but in America, ignorance still reigned. Bliss and his team had guessed the bullet's pathway wrong, cut new infected tracks through Garfield's body, and let pus fill in the spaces where healing should have begun. America grieved. Vice President Chester A. Arthur, devastated and unprepared, was sworn in the very next morning. Garfield's body was returned to Washington in a solemn procession, then taken to his home state of Ohio for burial. James A. Garfield did not die from a bullet. He died from ambition, ego, and medical arrogance. A crime that began with a gun ended with a scalpel, and a nation asking how this tragedy could have been prevented. In November of 1881, America watched in disbelief as the trial of President James A. Garfield's assassin began. The defendant, Charles J. Guiteau, unrepentant, arrogant, and completely captivated by his own infamy. Guiteau was defended, reluctantly, by his brother-in-law, George Scoville. But the trial quickly devolved into a spectacle. Guiteau insulted his own legal team, recited his testimony as long, rambling poems, and even passed handwritten notes to spectators in the courtroom asking for legal advice. He dictated his autobiography to a reporter from the New York Herald, ending with a personal ad for a nice Christian lady under 30. The courtroom was transfixed, some in horror, others in disbelief. Outside, the American public seethed with rage. Twice, mobs had nearly tore Guiteau apart, once during transport and again behind bars. But he seemed untouched by it all. He was planning a lecture tour after his release and a run for president in 1884. Guiteau's legal team pleaded an insanity defense, one of the first times it had been seriously attempted in a high-profile American trial. But Guiteau himself undermined them at every turn. He insisted he wasn't medically insane, only legally insane. To the jury, He appeared not as a man with mental illness, but as a manipulator trying to dodge justice. On January 25th, 1882, after weeks of chaotic testimony and growing public disgust, the jury found Charles Guiteau guilty of murder. His appeal was denied. June 30th, 1882, nearly a year to the day after Garfield was shot, Guiteau, ever theatrical, danced up the steps to the gallows, waving to the crowd like a celebrity. He shook hands with the executioner. "I am going to the Lordy, I am so glad." He had written the poem himself and begged for an orchestra to accompany his final performance. The request was denied. Instead, he dropped the piece of paper as a signal and the trapdoor opened. Guiteau was buried in an unmarked grave. His brain and skull were preserved and studied for years.